Racist cop targets black father at diner. Unaware he's a Judge City forced to pay $1.1 million. The Riverside Diner in suburban Ohio had that peculiar quality of places that exist outside of time. It smelled like burnt coffee and possibility. The kind of establishment where regulars were greeted by name, where the waitstaff knew your order before you sat down, where the booth vinyl bore the comfortable patina of thousands of ordinary conversations. Outside, October sunlight streamed through the windows with that particular golden quality, the kind that only arrives in early fall, when the world seems to be holding its breath before winter. In a corner booth overlooking the quiet main street, Arthur Maxwell sat across from his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. She was still wearing her yellow soccer uniform, the jersey slightly too large, the fabric carrying the evidence of a morning spent sliding through autumn mud. Emma's braids tied back with matching yellow ribbons had begun to come loose during the game. A few wisps of hair framed her face. She was attacking a plate of chocolate chip pancakes with the focused intensity of a small athlete, someone who had just expended enormous energy on a muddy field. Arthur, at 52 years old, had the kind of presence that commanded attention. Even when he was trying his hardest to be invisible, he wore a faded Georgetown University hoodie, several years past its prime. The fabric soft and worn in that way that only comes from genuine repeated use. Not fashionable distress, real distress. His gray sweatpants were comfortable and unfashionable. He hadn't shaved that morning. His dark brown skin bore a shadow of stubble that made him look tired but approachable. A plain baseball cap sat on the table beside him. To all appearances, he was just another father, squeezing in a post-sports practice breakfast before moving on to the rest of his Saturday. But if you looked carefully, really looked, you could see other things in Arthur. There was something in the way he held himself, even seated, that suggested an internal architecture of discipline and control. His posture was impeccably straight, his shoulders broad beneath the loose hoodie. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and constantly in motion. They tracked the waitress moving through the diner with practiced grace. They noted the elderly couple 2 tables over reading the morning paper. They registered the delivery truck turning the corner outside, the stray dog investigating the fire hydrant across the street, the young mother pushing a stroller 3 blocks away in the distance. It was an involuntary reflex, the ghost of an operational mindset that had been drilled into him over 20 years of federal service that never quite faded, even in retirement. Sarah Jenkins, the weekend waitress, knew both Arthur and Emma well. She was a college student working her way through nursing school, and she genuinely liked the Pendletons. They were generous with tips, unfailingly polite, a stark contrast to the demanding church crowd that came through on Sunday mornings. When Emma asked with that particular enthusiasm only a child can muster if she could please maybe get extra whipped cream on her pancakes, Sarah grinned. Arthur smiled at his daughter, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face. "Only if you promise not to tell your mother I let you eat sugar before noon," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to carry the weight of authority even when he was being playful. "Can you keep a secret?" Emma nodded solemnly, sealing the pact with the gravity of childhood promise-making. Sarah brought the coffee and the amended pancakes. The whipped cream piled so high it could barely stay on the plate, and the moment felt complete. Perfect. The kind of Saturday morning that parents and children look back on 20 years later and remember as evidence that some moments in life are exactly as good as they seem in real time. Arthur took a sip of his coffee and watched his daughter navigate the logistics of eating pancakes. Pancakes topped with what appeared to be most of a dairy cow's worth of whipped cream. He thought about how different this moment was from other parts of his life. How quiet it was, how safe. That was the thing about Oak Ridge, the particular suburb where Riverside Diner sat. It had been chosen specifically for its safety. After 20 years in federal law enforcement, first as an agent investigating organized crime, then as a consultant to the Justice Department on international terrorism cases, Arthur had learned to read danger the way other people read weather. He could sense it coming, he understood the signs, and he had made a deliberate choice, when his body had started failing him a decade ago, to find a place where danger didn't live. Oak Ridge was that place. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, quiet afternoons, the kind of community where the biggest news was the school board meeting or a missing pet. Arthur had chosen it specifically because it was the kind of place where a man could teach his daughter that the world was fundamentally safe, fundamentally good, where he could let his guard down, just a little bit, and simply be a father. 3 miles away, driving through the commercial district on the outskirts of town, Officer Marcus Wade sat in his patrol car. his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Wade was 34 years old, thick-necked, with the kind of physical presence that came from hours in the gym, and the particular arrogance that some men cultivated alongside their muscles. His uniform was crisp and tight, his duty belt heavy with equipment, flashlight, radio, pepper spray, handcuffs, and a service weapon that he had come to think of as an extension of his authority, rather than a tool to be used with restraint. He wore mirrored sunglasses pushed up on the back of his neck, and his jaw was clenched. In that way, it always clenched when he was working himself into a particular headspace. Wade had a monologue that ran constantly in his head, a narrative about power and control and the proper order of things. In this narrative, certain people belonged in certain places. Oak Ridge belonged to people like him. Other people were transient, threatening, out of place. If anyone had looked at his personnel file and Chief Robert Harrison had repeatedly, with growing frustration, they would have found something troubling. 14 complaints of excessive force over 6 years, 9 of them involving minorities, all of them mysteriously dismissed or settled quietly by the police union, which existed primarily to protect its own. No matter what those own had done, Chief Harrison had tried repeatedly to build a case against Wade, to find the smoking gun that would allow him to strip the officer of his badge. But Wade was cunning in a way that suggested intelligence being used entirely for the wrong purposes. He knew where the camera blind spots were. He knew how to write a report that made the victim sound like the aggressor. He had learned to operate in the spaces where documentation was incomplete and witness intimidation was plausible. Wade's reputation was split along racial lines. Among certain circles, the retired cops, the conservative business owners, the people who thought that real policing meant aggressive presence, swift punishment for anyone who questioned authority. Wade was considered the gold standard, a no-nonsense cop, a man who kept the town safe. But among the minority residents who lived on the outskirts or commuted through Oak Ridge, Wade was known for what he actually was, a hazard, the kind of officer who would pull you over for a taillight that wasn't actually broken, or tail your car for 3 miles just to justify a stop, or search your vehicle on the basis of suspicion so vague that it barely registered as suspicion at all. As Wade drove his jaw clenched tighter, the monologue in his head had become more insistent lately. Voices were starting to question his authority. People who should have known better were talking back, citing their rights, suggesting through their refusal to submit that Wade wasn't actually the dominant force he imagined himself to be. It was infuriating. It was a personal insult. And on this particular Saturday morning in October, Wade was in exactly the kind of mood where he might do something he'd end up regretting. Not that he would regret it immediately. That would come later, if it came at all. Arthur was finishing his coffee and calculating the logistics, getting Emma home in time for her shower before lunch, when his operational instincts, the ones he thought had retired along with the rest of him, sent up a subtle but persistent alarm. There was nothing obvious, nothing he could point to and say that's the problem. It was more like a bass note, too low for conscious hearing, but registering nonetheless in the part of his brain that had spent 2 decades learning to read patterns in human behavior. The patrol car had cruised past the diner twice. That wasn't necessarily significant. A patrol car could drive past a diner twice for any number of reasons. But Wade had slowed down the second time. Wade had lingered. And Wade had a particular kind of awareness. That suggested he was looking for something specific. Arthur filed that observation away, without mentioning it to Emma. There was no point in alarming her. Besides, whatever Wade was looking for, it probably wasn't going to find them in the diner. They were safe here. The diner was public, populated, on a main street. Whatever was about to happen, if anything happened at all, would have witnesses. After breakfast, after Sarah brought the check and Arthur left a generous tip, he wheeled Emma out onto the sidewalk and began the short walk toward the crosswalk that would take them back toward the residential streets in their car. The morning was still perfect. The sun was still warm. Emma was happy, her stomach full of pancakes and whipped cream. Her earlier soccer exhaustion beginning to give way to the second wind. That usually hit children mid-morning. They reached the corner of 4th Avenue and the pedestrian crossing light. Arthur checked both ways, a habit from 30 years of paying attention to details others overlooked, and engaged the joystick on his wheelchair. The device rolled smoothly off the curb ramp and onto the asphalt. The crosswalk was clear. The light was still favorable. They were going to make it across without incident. That was when the honey jar slipped. Arthur had bought it from the farmer's market earlier in the week, an expensive artisanal variety from a local producer, the kind of thing that was more indulgence than necessity. He had held it on his lap in the canvas bag, but the wheelchair's motion had created a subtle shift in momentum. The jar had rolled forward. Arthur had reached to catch it, and in that moment of divided attention, his hand had been just a fraction of a second too slow. The jar hit the pavement with a distinctive sound. Not quite a crash, not quite a shatter, but that particular acoustic signature that comes from quality glass. Meeting unforgiving concrete at the wrong angle, it broke completely. Glass scattering across the white lines of the crosswalk. Golden honey spreading in thick, viscous rivulets. Arthur sighed. It was a small thing, a minor inconvenience, easily replaceable. But he didn't want to leave the glass there. Someone could puncture a tire on those shards. Another car could come through and spread the mess further. So he stopped the wheelchair in the middle of the street, put it in park, and carefully leaned forward to assess the situation. He reached into his side pouch to grab a small rag, a habit from his operational days, always being prepared for small emergencies, and began to push the larger pieces of glass toward the gutter. He was so focused on this small, ordinary task that he almost didn't hear the roar of the patrol car's engine. As it turned onto 4th Avenue, Officer Marcus Wade was at the wheel. Wade slammed on the brakes with aggressive force, and the patrol car's tires squealed in protest as the heavy vehicle lurched to a halt, merely 10 feet from Arthur's wheelchair. The sudden violent stop sent a jolt of adrenaline through Officer Thomas Miller, the rookie in the passenger seat, who braced his hands against the dashboard and felt his heart rate spike. In response to his training officer's unpredictable behavior, Marcus Wade sat motionless for a moment, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. He was staring at Arthur with an intensity that had nothing to do with traffic safety, and everything to do with the monologue in his head. What is this guy doing? Wade thought, his face already flushing with the kind of irrational anger that seemed to bubble up in him whenever he encountered something that didn't fit his mental map of how the world should be organized. Wade slammed his palm against the steering wheel horn, letting out a prolonged, deafening blast that shattered the quiet suburban afternoon. The sound was aggressive, purposeful, designed to communicate dominance. It was the sound of power asserting itself, of a man with a badge and a weapon demanding submission. Arthur flinched slightly at the noise. He was human after all, and the sound was startling, but he did not panic. He did not jerk involuntarily or show fear. Instead, he slowly straightened his posture, carefully setting the rag down on his lap with deliberate precision. Then he turned his head to look over his shoulder at the patrol car. He raised one hand in a calm, apologetic gesture. Keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening, he pointed down at the broken glass and spilled honey, signaling clearly that he was temporarily delayed, and that the delay was the result of a small accident, not deliberate obstruction. To any reasonable observer, and there were several in nearby cars on nearby sidewalks, the situation was transparent. An elderly man in a wheelchair had dropped something. He had stopped in the crosswalk to manage the situation in a reasonable way. He was communicating that he was aware of the traffic and was minimizing the obstruction. It was a minor incident, easily managed, of no consequence. To Officer Marcus Wade, who was looking at the world through the filter of his own racism and his own need for dominance, the situation meant something entirely different. What Wade saw was a black man in a wheelchair, a man who Wade had already categorized as not belonging in Oak Ridge, who was refusing to instantly scatter at the sound of a police horn. What Wade saw was defiance. What Wade saw was a challenge to his authority that could not and would not be tolerated. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Wade growled, unbuckling his seatbelt with violent speed. His movements were aggressive, designed to convey frustration and impatience. "Look at this guy. Thinks he owns the damn street. Probably intoxicated or looking for a payout." Miller, the rookie officer, started to speak, his voice trembling slightly, with the uncertainty of someone who was still trying to navigate the complicated space between following orders and following his own conscience. "Sir, he's in a wheelchair. It looks like he dropped something." "Shut up, Miller. I'm handling this," Wade snapped, his voice cutting and authoritative. He kicked the patrol car door open and stormed out into the afternoon heat, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon, an intimidation tactic he used as naturally as breathing, a gesture that was supposed to communicate that he had the power to hurt you if you didn't comply. Arthur watched the officer approach through the rearview mirror attached to his wheelchair handle. He noted everything: the aggressive, wide-legged stride, the flushed complexion, the flared nostrils, the hand near the weapon. In that moment, Arthur's decades of training in reading violent offenders crystallized into perfect clarity. He recognized in Marcus Wade's approach a man who was high on his own artificial authority. He was facing Arthur understood a person who had mistaken the uniform for actual power and who had built his entire self-image on the assumption that everyone around him would submit to his will. Arthur had encountered men like this before. He knew their patterns. He knew how they escalated. He knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened in the next few minutes was going to be determined not by reason or law, but by Wade's need to restore the dominance that Arthur's simple refusal to panic had already begun to undermine. "I need to see your identification," Wade demanded, approaching the wheelchair. His voice was sharp, flat, and heavily laced with an expectation of immediate submission. It wasn't phrased as a request. It was phrased as a command, the kind of thing that expected compliance. In response to the authority of the badge, Arthur paused for a moment, taking in the situation with the clarity that came from having spent a lifetime in courtrooms and crime scenes, learning to read the precise moment when confrontation could still be de-escalated, and the moment when it had passed beyond that possibility. The warm, relaxed father vanished in a fraction of a second. In his place emerged something different, something that had been cultivated over 20 years of federal service, then refined over another 15 years of sitting on the bench. As a judge, in his place emerged Arthur the jurist, the man who had spent 2 decades in the legal system. First as a ruthless defense attorney, willing to find the loopholes in bad prosecutions. Then as a brilliant prosecutor, willing to pursue justice with the full force of the law. And finally, for the past 5 years as a highly respected judge. In the 4th District Court, a man who understood constitutional rights at a molecular level. A man who had spent 5 years making decisions that affected people's lives, based on whether officers like Marcus Wade were acting within their authority or exceeding it. His mind trained to process legal parameters, constitutional rights, and human behavior evaluated the situation in real time. Wade had no reasonable suspicion that a crime had been committed. Arthur was in a public place, doing nothing illegal, sitting in his wheelchair eating breakfast with his daughter. There was no probable cause. There was no emergency. There was only Marcus Wade's own racism and his own need for power. "Excuse me," Arthur replied, keeping his voice low and steady. It was the voice he used in the courtroom when he was about to explain why a prosecution's case had fatal flaws. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm cleaning up something I dropped. My daughter and I were about to head home." "You heard me," Wade barked, leaning in slightly, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate. "I said I need to see your ID." Emma had stopped eating, her fork hovered over her pancakes, and her big eyes darted between her father and the angry police officer, looming over their table. She was a smart child, intelligent and perceptive, and she could sense that something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere around them. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What's happening?" "It's okay, sweetie. Eat your breakfast," Arthur reassured her, without breaking eye contact with Wade. He placed his napkin carefully on the table, a gesture of deliberation rather than panic. "Officer, my daughter and I are just having breakfast. Is there a problem?" "The problem is you're making people uncomfortable," Wade lied effortlessly. It was a standard line, a catch-all excuse that he used to justify Terry's stops without reasonable suspicion. He had used it dozens of times, and it had worked dozens of times, because most people didn't know their rights. They didn't know that making people uncomfortable wasn't legal grounds for a stop. "We've had some issues with transients in this area. I need to know who you are and what your business is here." Arthur's jaw tightened, the sheer audacity of the lie. The blatant racial profiling occurring in broad daylight ignited a cold, calculated fire inside him. Arthur knew the law better than the man wearing the badge. He had studied it for 2 decades. He had practiced it. He had taught it. He knew that in the state of Ohio, an officer cannot demand identification without reasonable articulable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. "I am perfectly aware of the law regarding stop and identify, officer," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the commanding, resonant tone he usually reserved for his courtroom. "And unless you have reasonable suspicion that I am committing a crime, I am not required to provide you with my identification while eating breakfast with my daughter." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge that Wade couldn't ignore. Marcus Wade's face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but with the specific fury of a man whose authority had been publicly questioned. He wasn't used to people knowing their rights. He certainly wasn't used to being spoken to with such calm, unyielding authority by someone he had already mentally categorized as lesser, as someone who should defer to his power. Miller the rookie wanted to say something but didn't. He had been trained by the police academy to believe that officers always had a legitimate basis for their actions, but he was also human enough and young enough, and idealistic enough, to recognize that something was wrong here. The man in the wheelchair hadn't done anything, except refuse to submit. There was no crime. There was no emergency. There was only Marcus Wade's ego. And that wasn't legal grounds for anything. You think you're smart. Wade said, his voice dropping to something colder, something more dangerous than anger. He stepped closer to the diner, his agitation becoming visible in every movement. Sarah Jenkins, the waitress, saw what was happening. She had seen Wade do this before, to delivery drivers and out-of-town landscapers, who didn't understand that they were trespassing on his domain simply by existing in it. Her hand moved toward the phone behind the counter, just in case. The training she'd received as a child of a marginalized community had taught her that this was how these things started, with an officer who wouldn't accept that his power had limits. Arthur was in the middle of the street now, having wheeled himself the rest of the way across the intersection. Wade was still approaching, his body language becoming more aggressive, his hand drifting further down, toward the butt of his service weapon. The threat was becoming more explicit. The intimidation was becoming more physical. "Officer, I have a legal right to be here," Arthur said, his voice remaining calm but firmer now, taking on the weight of authority. "I have the right to refuse to provide identification without reasonable suspicion. That's constitutional law. That's not my opinion. That's the law of this state." Arthur's composure was itself becoming a problem for Wade. The officer had built his entire approach to law enforcement on the assumption that people would break under pressure, that they would give in once he asserted his authority with sufficient force. But Arthur wasn't breaking. Arthur wasn't giving in. Arthur was standing firm, in the knowledge that he was right, that he was protected by the Constitution, and that the law, not Wade's perception of his own authority, but the actual law, was on his side. This realization, the slow dawning comprehension, that his authority was being questioned, and that the person questioning it actually had legal grounds to do so, seemed to push Wade over an invisible threshold. The other customers in the diner had stopped eating entirely now. The entire restaurant had become an audience, watching to see what Marcus Wade would do. When his power was finally directly and publicly challenged, Wade slowly unhooked his thumbs from his belt. He took a slow, deliberate step away from the counter, leaving his waiting breakfast behind, abandoned in a moment of rage that had priority over hunger. His pale blue eyes scanned the dining room one more time, as if seeing it for the first time, as if registering for the first time that he was no longer the dominant force in the room. Instead, he was a man in uniform, challenged by a man in a wheelchair, and losing. Wade's face had gone red, not the red of embarrassment, but the specific crimson that comes before explosions. He leaned across the table, his massive frame casting a shadow over Emma. His hand drifted down to his belt, not toward his weapon, but toward the assumption of authority itself. The unconscious tell that everyone in the diner recognized. The gesture that communicated, "I will use whatever force I have. I will hurt you if I have to." Arthur didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't submit. He maintained his eye contact with Wade, and in that moment something shifted irrevocably between them. Arthur was communicating through his body language and his refusal to break that he would not be intimidated, that he understood his rights, that he was willing to accept the consequences of asserting those rights rather than submit to illegal authority. "This is your final warning," Wade said, stepping closer. His physical size meant to intimidate. Arthur remained completely still, demonstrating that physical size was irrelevant in the face of legal certainty. The diner was absolutely silent now. Customers weren't even pretending to eat anymore. They were watching. They were bearing witness. They were part of the story now, whether Wade recognized it or not. "You can warn me all you like," Arthur replied quietly, "but I'm not obligated to comply with an unlawful order. So either you step back and let us finish breakfast, or you explain to a jury why you assaulted a man who was committing no crime." The word hung in the air. Jury. It was a word that meant something specific in a courtroom. It was a word that meant consequences. It was a word that suggested that Wade's actions would be subject to examination by people who understood the law. Wade's jaw clenched. His entire body went rigid. The specific fury of a man whose authority had been not just questioned, but publicly dismantled in front of witnesses, was about to express itself in the only way Wade knew how. "Get up." Wade said, his voice flat now, stripped of all pretense of legality. "Now." Emma made a small sound, a whimper. Her hand reached across the table toward her father. Arthur placed his hand on her arm, keeping his eyes on Wade. "Sir, I'm not going to." That's when Wade moved. The officer's hand grabbed Arthur's wrist with sudden, shocking violence. The grip was strong, brutal, designed to hurt. Arthur didn't resist. demonstrating compliance, proving that Wade's force was unnecessary, that it was punishment rather than apprehension. But Wade was already past the point where reason could reach him. He was operating purely on the need to reassert dominance, the need to break the man who had dared, to suggest that Marcus Wade didn't have the authority to do whatever he wanted. Wade twisted Arthur's arm, forcing him to stand. Arthur's wheelchair created complications. He couldn't move easily, couldn't comply with the kind of fluid obedience that Wade demanded, which meant that Wade applied more force, unnecessary force, excessive force, the kind of force that left marks. "You think you're smart," Wade was saying, repeating the phrase like a mantra, like he was trying to convince himself, even as he was trying to convince Arthur. "You think you know the law. You're just another." He stopped abruptly, realizing that he was about to say something. On audio and video, that would make his position even worse. His lawyer had warned him about this. Don't say anything that sounds racial. Don't confirm the bias. Keep it about procedure and law and public safety. Sarah Jenkins had her phone in her hand, recording everything. Multiple other customers had their phones out as well. The amber light of the diner, which had seemed so warm and welcoming just minutes before, now illuminated something different. The clear, undeniable fact that an officer of the law was assaulting a man for the crime of knowing his constitutional rights. Arthur's head struck the concrete as Wade threw him to the ground, his knee driving into Arthur's back. The violence was shocking in its brutality and in its complete lack of justification. A black man in a public place eating breakfast with his daughter, assaulted for asserting his legal rights. There was no argument about what was happening. There was no ambiguity. Every witness in the diner understood exactly what they were seeing. Emma screamed. It was a child's scream, the kind of sound that comes from the deepest places of fear and confusion and helplessness. Her father was on the ground. An armed officer was hurting him, and there was nothing Emma could do to stop it. The sound of Emma's scream was something Arthur would never fully escape. It would haunt him in the days and weeks that followed, in the moments when his mind insisted on replaying the scene, on returning to that moment when his daughter's sense of safety had been shattered. Alongside everything else, Arthur's wrists, when they were eventually examined, would show the marks of Wade's handcuffs. Not just the normal marks that come from having your wrists restrained, but the specific trauma marks of excessive tightness, of force applied beyond what was necessary. The police would claim that Arthur had resisted, a standard claim that was immediately contradicted by every piece of video evidence and every witness statement. But in those immediate moments, as Wade was restraining him, as the officer was barking orders that had no legal basis, the only thing Arthur could focus on was Emma. His daughter was crying. His daughter was frightened. And Arthur couldn't protect her from this. He couldn't use his knowledge of the law or his understanding of constitutional rights to make his child's terror stop. "It's okay, baby," Arthur called out, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the weight of the officer on his back, despite the pain in his wrists. "Daddy's okay. Just stay there. Stay right there." But Emma wasn't okay. Emma was 8 years old, and she had just watched her father assaulted. She had just experienced in the most direct and undeniable way possible what it meant to be vulnerable to authority. She had just learned that knowing the law didn't protect you, doing the right thing didn't protect you, being a father trying to do right by your daughter didn't protect you. She had learned that the uniform meant power, and power could hurt you. Sarah Jenkins was talking into her phone, calling 911, reporting an officer-involved assault. Other customers were narrating what they were seeing, describing the violence, providing their names as witnesses. The diner that had been a sanctuary just minutes before had become a crime scene. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. The police arrived 6 minutes after that. 2 additional patrol cars, dispatched not because there was an emergency, but because Wade had called for backup, claiming that a suspect was being uncooperative. The fiction was instantly contradicted by the body camera footage and the witness statements. But the fiction was what went into the initial report. EMTs examined Arthur carefully, noting the bruises, the wrist injuries, the scrapes where his skin had contacted concrete. They documented everything with the methodical precision of people who had seen this kind of injury pattern before. The assault had been photographed from multiple angles by multiple phones. It had been recorded by the diner's security camera. It had been witnessed by dozens of people. Emma was wrapped in a blanket by Sarah, who refused to let the child out of her sight. The blanket was intended to provide warmth, but what Emma needed was safety, and that was something no blanket could provide anymore. Chief Robert Harrison arrived at the scene personally. He was a stern man in his 60s, the kind of career law enforcement officer who believed in doing things by the book. in following procedure, in maintaining the integrity of the institution. When he watched the body cam footage, his face darkened. He understood exactly what he was looking at. This wasn't a difficult judgment call. This wasn't a situation where reasonable officers might disagree about the appropriate use of force. This was a clear documented assault. Wade had already filed his report, claiming that Arthur had been aggressive, resistant, and threatening. The fiction in the written word contradicted everything that the camera had captured. But Wade had spent years learning how to write reports that could survive initial scrutiny. The truth would emerge later. But in those first hours, the official narrative was whatever Wade claimed it to be. Internal Affairs investigation opened, but it opened slowly, methodically, with the kind of pace that suggested no one was in a hurry to establish facts. That would be inconvenient. Meanwhile, the police union had already been notified. A lawyer had already been assigned to Wade's case. The machinery of institutional protection was already grinding into motion. Arthur's wife, Rebecca, was beside herself. She had spent the better part of 20 years as the spouse of a federal agent, understanding danger abstractly. But this was different. This wasn't danger from criminals. This was danger from the people who were supposed to protect you. This was violation by the state. She held her daughter, who had stopped crying, but had begun to dissociate, to retreat into that place. The children go when the world has become too much to process. Rebecca made phone calls. She found an attorney. She began the process of documenting everything that had happened, because she understood, even as it was happening, that they would need proof. Days passed, then weeks. No charges were filed against Wade. The investigation into his conduct was open, but it was moving at a pace that suggested no one was particularly motivated to bring it to closure. Arthur's attorney, Jonathan Hayes, a brilliant civil rights lawyer with a reputation for taking cases others wouldn't touch, began investigating Wade's history himself. What Hayes found was disturbing. 14 complaints of excessive force over 6 years, 9 of them involving minorities, all of them mysteriously dismissed or settled quietly by the police union. The pattern was there for anyone willing to look. It was just a pattern that nobody with institutional power seemed willing to see. Hayes obtained Wade's duty records and analyzed them. Of all the neighborhoods Wade patrolled, his stops were disproportionately concentrated in areas with minority populations. The data was stark. 89% of Wade's stops involved Black or Latino residents, despite the fact that he had equal patrol assignment across neighborhoods that were demographically diverse. The pattern wasn't an accident. It was a choice. But the most damning evidence came from Wade's text messages that had somehow survived deletion attempts, and that revealed in his own words the racist calculations he was making. Messages about easy targets in specific neighborhoods, messages about groups of people he referred to with slurs, messages that made it absolutely clear that Marcus Wade wasn't stopping people because they had committed crimes, but because of what they looked like and where they came from. Chief Harrison wanted to investigate further. He wanted to bring this forward, to force the department to confront what it had created and enabled. But Captain Victor Lang, who served as the union president, blocked every move. The union existed for one purpose: to protect its members. No matter what those members had done, the union's lawyers made it clear that any investigation into Wade would be met with legal resistance. The union would fight. The union would tie up the case in procedure. For years, City Legal told Arthur's family, unlikely to proceed, officer followed procedures. It was a line that suggested they had already made their decision, that they had already chosen to protect Wade, rather than to hold him accountable. What the city didn't know was that someone inside the department was beginning to leak information. Detective Maria Santos from Internal Affairs had been quietly investigating Wade for 8 months on her own time. Santos had spent a career watching the department protect bad officers, and she had reached a breaking point when Chief Harrison had ordered her to stop the investigation. When he had classified it and buried it, Santos had made copies of everything. She reached out to Arthur's attorney with a flash drive. What was on that drive was the complete documentation of Wade's corruption, not just the personal assaults, but the pattern. Santos had discovered something that made the story even bigger than anyone had initially understood. Metro Towing Company was contracted with the city to handle traffic enforcement tows. The contract was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, but the contract's profitability depended on one thing: volume. They needed a certain number of vehicles towed every month to make the numbers work. The city received revenue from the towing contracts, but so did certain officers, and there was evidence that the contract incentives had created a quota system, a system that encouraged officers to make stops that would result in towed vehicles. Wade's patrol patterns suddenly made sense. He wasn't randomly targeting minority neighborhoods. He was targeting neighborhoods where he could make stops that would result in vehicle tows. Neighborhoods where he knew the residents might not have the resources to fight back, to hire lawyers, to challenge the legality of the stops. Neighborhoods where he could act with impunity. The financial trail was complicated but traceable. Metro Towing paid the city revenue. Some of that money flowed back to officers through various channels, and Captain Lang, union president and supervisor of Wade's division, had a financial interest in Metro Towing through his brother, who owned the storage facility that the tow company used. This wasn't one officer being bad. This was an institution that had created the conditions for a bad officer to flourish. This was corruption that ran from the streets to the administrative level to the union that existed to protect it. The federal government took notice. The Department of Justice opened a preliminary inquiry into civil rights violations. The FBI expressed interest. The magnitude of what had started as a single incident in a diner had suddenly expanded into something much larger and much more damaging to the institutional credibility of the entire police department. Arthur sat in his home office, looking at the evidence that Hayes had compiled. 14 complaints, 89% of stops targeting minorities, text messages using racist language, a quota system that incentivized stops, a cover-up that went all the way up to the administrative level, a brother with a financial interest in the towing company. The web of corruption was complex, but it was also clear. Hayes had 2 settlement offers on his desk. The first $800,000, confidential settlement. All parties agree not to discuss details. The fiction in that settlement would be that the city had made a generous offer, that Arthur had accepted, and that the matter was closed. Chief Harrison would remain in his position. Wade would likely be transferred. The broader corruption would remain hidden. The second offer, public case, federal charges, media exposure, the possibility of holding the entire system accountable. It would take years. It would be exhausting. His family would be in the spotlight. The entire time, Arthur stood in the doorway of his office and watched Emma through the window of her bedroom. She was 9 years old now, though the birthday had passed. In a fog of processing and trauma, she was struggling in school. She had nightmares. She asked questions at night that a 9-year-old shouldn't have to ask. Dad, why did that police officer hurt you? Dad, are there other police officers like that? Dad, will it happen again? Arthur couldn't answer those questions with the comfortable reassurance that parents usually provided. The truth was that yes, there were other officers like Wade. The truth was that it could happen again. The truth was that the only way to prevent it from happening again was to make sure that the system that protected Wade was exposed and changed. He made his decision that night. Arthur told Hayes that they would pursue the federal case. They would fight publicly. They would expose the corruption. They would hold the system accountable, not just for himself, but for every other person that Wade had targeted, every other family that had been violated by the machinery of institutional abuse. 6 months after the incident, Marcus Wade sat in a deposition room, facing Jonathan Hayes across a table. Wade's own attorney was present, and he was already looking uncomfortable. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, but Wade had been instructed not to give anything away, not to admit to anything, not to provide Hayes with anything that could be used against him. Hayes began systematically. He presented the patrol data first, showing the geographic concentration of Wade's stops. He showed how 89% of those stops involved minorities, far beyond the demographic representation of those neighborhoods. Wade's attorney objected, arguing that the data was being misinterpreted, but the data was what it was. Then Hayes presented the text messages, message after message, revealing Wade's calculations about which neighborhoods were easy targets, which residents wouldn't lawyer up. Messages using language so explicitly racist that Wade's attorney rubbed his eyes in defeat before the question had even been asked. Wade fought initially. He denied the obvious, claimed that the data was being misinterpreted, that he was doing his job, that he wasn't targeting anyone based on race. He was lying, but he was lying with the confidence of someone who had learned that many lies survive if they're told with sufficient authority. But as Hayes methodically worked through the evidence, as the contradictions became impossible to maintain, as the accumulated weight of documented proof became impossible to explain away, Wade's position began to crumble. Hayes played the body cam footage from the diner, showed Wade's face twisted with irrational rage, showed Arthur's compliance, showed the complete absence of any legitimate basis for the stop or the use of force. "Officer Wade?" Hayes asked quietly, in the body camera footage. "At what point do you believe you had reasonable suspicion to demand identification?" Wade hesitated. The individual was acting suspiciously, being evasive, refusing to comply with a lawful order. "A lawful order you admit you didn't have authority to make," Hayes interrupted. "The man was eating pancakes with his child. How is that suspicious?" He matched a profile. "A profile you're now going to describe for the record." Wade's attorney leaned forward, touched his arm, a signal warning him not to continue. But Wade pressed on, defensive now, unable to accept that his authority was being questioned. "Young males in that demographic commit the majority of violent crimes in this district. I'm trained to assume someone is a criminal because of their race." "No, that's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said, officer, and we have it recorded." Wade's face went pale. He opened his mouth. His attorney touched his arm again, more forcefully this time, but Wade had already snapped. The testimony that was supposed to protect him had become his confession. The mask had slipped entirely. "People who think they're smarter than you," Wade said, his voice rising in a desperate panic. "People coming into nice neighborhoods and acting like they own it. People who don't respect the badge." The statement hung in the air. It was in its own way an admission of everything. An admission that he had targeted Arthur, not because of any crime, but because Arthur was a black man, in a neighborhood that Wade thought black men shouldn't be in. An admission that he had used his authority to punish intelligence. An admission that the assault had been about ego, about the need to reassert dominance. When his authority was questioned, "People like me?" Arthur asked quietly, from where he was sitting in the room, the question hanging in the air, like an executioner's axe. Wade slumped back in his chair, putting his head in his hands. He was a ruined man. He had just confessed his bias on tape. He knew it. His lawyer knew it, and Arthur knew it. Following the disastrous deposition, the city of Fairview's legal counsel called an emergency meeting with the mayor and the city council. The city was facing a jury trial in federal court, with a plaintiff who was a revered judge, backed by irrefutable HD video evidence, and a deposition where the offending officer practically admitted to racial profiling and institutional corruption. If the case went to a jury, the punitive damages alone could bankrupt the municipality. They had no choice but to surrender unconditionally. But the settlement that Arthur and Jonathan Hayes dictated was not a quiet affair, held behind closed doors. Judge Arthur Maxwell and his attorney refused to allow the municipality to sweep their institutional failures under the rug. With a confidential settlement, the terms they dictated were draconian, public, and designed to permanently alter the landscape of the town's law enforcement. On a rainy Tuesday morning in spring, the Fairview City Council convened a special emergency public session. The chamber was packed to the fire marshal's absolute limit, buzzing with local citizens, regional activists, lawyers, and a swarm of news cameras. The settlement was going to be announced publicly. The terms were going to be made public. The entire community was going to know exactly what had happened and what the city was doing about it. Mayor Thomas Harding, looking pale and thoroughly defeated, read the terms of the settlement into the public record. The city agreed to pay a staggering $1.1 million in compensatory and punitive damages to Arthur Maxwell and his family. The financial blow was only the beginning. As part of the legally binding consent decree, the Fairview Police Department was placed under the direct supervision of an independent civilian oversight board. Every single internal affairs complaint from the past decade was to be reopened and investigated by a third-party auditing firm. No more internal investigations, no more union protection, no more institutional cover-ups. Furthermore, Chief Robert Harrison was given an ultimatum: resign immediately and forfeit his accumulated administrative bonuses, or face a public firing and a potential state investigation for obstruction of justice. Regarding the hidden memo, Captain Victor Lang faced similar pressure. He had protected Wade. He had blocked investigations. His role in the corruption was becoming clear. Sterling, the old-school lawman, who had tried to do right, chose the coward's way out. He submitted his resignation the very next day, slipping out the back door of the precinct. He had mismanaged for years, his reputation completely destroyed. The institution was eating its own, but it was eating them only because it had no other choice. But the most profound, crushing wave of karma was reserved for the man who had started it all. Officer Greg Wade did not get to quietly resign. He did not get to transfer to a neighboring county and put on a different uniform. He did not get to fade away into some other jurisdiction where his past might be forgotten. Upon the conclusion of the civil settlement, the Department of Justice officially unsealed the federal indictment against him. Wade was arrested by FBI agents at his home, handcuffed on his own front lawn, in full view of his neighbors. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a severe federal felony that carried the possibility of significant prison time. The criminal trial was brief. The body camera footage from the Riverside Diner was played again and again. The text messages were presented in sequence, revealing the pattern of his thoughts, his calculations, his racist assessments of the people he had targeted. Witness after witness testified about their own encounters with Wade, about the pattern of abuse, about the fear he had generated in the communities he had patrolled. Wade's defense was that he had been doing his job, that he was following training, that the stops were justified. The defense crumbled under the weight of video evidence and documented proof. The jury took less than 3 hours to deliberate. When the verdict was read, Wade collapsed into his chair, weeping silently. He was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 36 months in a federal penitentiary. Upon his felony conviction, the state's Peace Officer Training Commission permanently revoked his law enforcement certification. He lost his pension. He lost his badge. He lost his freedom. The man who had terrorized his community with arbitrary power had been utterly stripped of it by the very legal system he had sworn to uphold and consistently mocked. In a press conference held on the steps of the federal courthouse, with his wife Rebecca holding his hand and his daughter Emma standing proudly beside them, Arthur announced his decision regarding the settlement. He kept not a single dime. The entire $1.1 million settlement was placed into a trust dedicated to a new foundation, the Equal Justice Foundation. The purpose of the foundation was explicit and clear: to provide elite civil rights legal representation for marginalized individuals who had been victimized by police misconduct and who lacked the financial resources to fight back on their own. The money that the city had paid to cover up Wade's abuse would now become a tool for hunting down other corrupt officers, for helping other families, for ensuring that what had happened to Arthur and Emma would not happen to others without consequences. Arthur spoke about change, about the importance of accountability, about the need for institutions to recognize their own corruption and to dismantle the machinery that protected it. He spoke about his daughter, about wanting her to grow up in a world where knowing your rights actually protected you, where authority was constrained by law, where the powerful couldn't abuse the vulnerable with impunity. The foundation would eventually help dozens of families. It would fund investigations into police misconduct in 3 different states. It would result in the criminal prosecution of 9 officers, the firing of 17 more, and the implementation of new oversight policies in 7 different police departments. But in that moment, standing on the courthouse steps, with the rain beginning to fall again, Arthur was thinking about Emma, about the nightmares, about the questions she had asked, about the fact that he could transform his daughter's trauma into something that might protect other children. Exactly 1 year after the incident, on a crisp October morning, the bell above the glass door of the Riverside Diner chimed. Arthur and Emma walked in, and it felt like returning to a place that had been sacred once, and that they had thought they might never return to again. Arthur was wearing the exact same faded navy blue Georgetown University hoodie that he had been wearing the year before. Emma, now 9 years old, was wearing her new soccer jersey from the upcoming season. The diner was bustling with the afternoon crowd, and Thomas Croft, the manager, rushed out from behind the counter with a massive, genuine smile. He shook Arthur's hand warmly, without the awkwardness of not knowing what to say, with the simple human recognition that sometimes we survive hard things and we come back to the places that mattered. Sarah Jenkins, who was now a fully registered nurse, but still visited the diner on weekends for coffee, came over and gave Emma a tight hug. There was something in the gesture, the simple normality of it, the lack of trauma, the return to ordinary affection, that seemed to restore something that had been broken. They sat in the exact same corner booth. By the window, the sunlight streamed in, warming the table. There were no arrogant shadows. There was no fear, just a father and his daughter, laughing over a plate of chocolate chip pancakes with extra whipped cream, in a town that had been forced to confront its own complicity and to implement real change. Emma asked her father a question about something else, not about police or fear or the events of the year before, but about something that a 9-year-old might ordinarily ask. And Arthur answered. And in that ordinary conversation lay something profound. The restoration of ordinary life, the return to the baseline that had been shattered and was now cautiously being rebuilt. The reforms that resulted from Arthur's decision to fight publicly were significant. The Fairview Police Department implemented mandatory body cameras for every officer, and footage became public within 72 hours of any incident. Quotas were banned entirely, not just in the towing context, but as an institutional practice. A civilian review board was established, with actual subpoena power, with the ability to investigate complaints without police interference, with independence from the institutional apparatus that had protected Wade. 3 other officers, whose misconduct became apparent during the third-party investigation, were suspended pending termination. 2 of them resigned before the termination process could be completed. 1 fought the termination, losing completely. Once the documented evidence of misconduct was presented to the public, Metro Towing lost its city contract. Craig Thompson, the owner, was facing civil suits from all the victims that Wade had targeted. The financial incentive structure that had encouraged racial targeting was dismantled. But perhaps most significantly, the ordinance that resulted from Arthur's case. Ordinance 2024-1118 became a template that other municipalities began to implement. 3 states passed legislation based on the specific reforms that had emerged from Arthur's fight. The Equal Justice Foundation expanded to help families in 5 different states. The conversation about police accountability, about institutional corruption, about the need for real oversight had shifted. It was imperfect, it was incomplete, but it was real change. Driven not by goodwill or sudden enlightenment, but by the fact that Arthur had refused to accept quiet settlement. He had forced the system to confront its own failures publicly. Emma, who was now 9 years old, asked her mother a question as they were leaving the diner that Saturday morning. "Is it safe now?" she asked simply. Rebecca paused. She could lie, make it simple, offer her daughter the comfort of false certainty, but Emma deserved the truth. Emma deserved to understand that the fight her father had waged had improved things, had created safeguards, had shifted the balance of power. But Emma also deserved to know that the fight wasn't finished, that the work of holding institutions accountable was ongoing, that eternal vigilance was the price of protection. "It's safer," Rebecca said, taking her daughter's hand as they walked toward the car. "We made it safer, but we have to keep watching. We have to make sure that people are doing the right thing. We have to make sure that cameras are working and oversight boards are functioning and that people remember why these changes matter." Emma nodded, processing this adult reality in the way that children process difficult truths when they're presented with honesty rather than false reassurance. The outcomes were mixed but real. Wade had faced criminal charges. Plea deal negotiations had been unnecessary. Once the evidence was overwhelming, Captain Lang was under federal investigation. His pension was at risk. 3 officers had been suspended. 2 had resigned. 1 was fighting termination. The institution had been forced to change, not because it wanted to, but because the alternative, the exposure of corruption, the public humiliation, the loss of authority, was worse. The real change was Ordinance 2024-1118. Body cameras were mandatory now. Footage was public within 72 hours. Quotas were banned. Civilian Review Board established, with subpoena power. Annual bias training required. It wasn't perfect, but it was demonstrably better than what had come before, Arthur had thought. That first Saturday after the incident, that all he wanted was his daughter back, his peace back, his old life back. But he had learned that sometimes the fight doesn't end when you win. Sometimes the fight ends when you recognize that the victory you fought for is actually a beginning, not an ending. Emma's generation would grow up in a world that was slightly more accountable, slightly more just, because one man had refused to be silent. Several months had passed. The story that had begun with a broken jar of honey and a father protecting his daughter had rippled outward, had become part of the larger conversation about power and accountability and the price of justice. But standing in the diner, looking at his daughter laughing over pancakes, Arthur understood that the fight had been worth it. The trauma, the publicity, the years of legal battle, it had been worth it because it had changed things. It had protected others. It had forced an institution to confront its own corruption and to implement real change. He thought about the victims, whose cases the Equal Justice Foundation would eventually take. He thought about the families who would be spared the experience that his family had endured because the system had been forced to change. He thought about the officers, the good ones, who would be protected by the reforms, who would be able to do their jobs without being associated with the corruption that the bad ones had created. The story of that October Saturday The moment when Arthur Maxwell, a retired federal agent and sitting judge, had encountered Marcus Wade, a corrupt officer drunk on his own authority, would eventually extend far beyond Fairview, Ohio. It would become part of the national conversation about police accountability, about the need for real oversight, about the power of one family's refusal to accept injustice quietly. But in that moment, it was simply about a father and his daughter sitting in a diner, sharing pancakes, having returned to the place that had been shattered and emerged, if not unchanged, then at least aware of what needed to be changed. The bell above the door chimed as they prepared to leave. The sun was warm. The day was ordinary, and for the first time in a year, that ordinariness felt like a victory. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself thinking about the courage it took to stand up to authority, if you recognized the importance of accountability and change, we encourage you to subscribe our channel. We tell these stories of people who face injustice and choose to fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who comes after, because we believe they matter, because they remind us that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law, because they demonstrate that institutional corruption can be exposed, that reform is possible, and that the price of justice is always worth paying. Subscribe our channel. Don't miss the next story of courage, accountability, and the power of refusing to look away.